Hello everyone and welcome to a new lecture for international reporting. This week we'll be studying terrorism, and while terrorism seems to have ebbed somewhat in the past year or so, it's constantly in the background and can pop up anytime. So let me talk first of all about the definitions of terrorism. And so we go back to a long time ago, the government intimidation during the Reign of Terror in France in the late 18th century is considered terrorism. The general sense of the systematic use of terror as a policy was first recorded in English just before the turn of the 19th century. The League of Nations which was short-lived, had language which defined terrorism as all criminal acts directed against a state and intended or calculated to create a state of terror in the minds of particular persons or a group of persons or the general public. In 1989, the United States defined it as premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents. 2002, the European Union said, given their nature or context, acts which may seriously damage a country or an international organizations were committed with the aim of seriously intimidating a population. So the definitions vary from time period to time period. The U.S. legal definition is that activities that involve violent acts or acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of criminal laws of the U.S. or of any state, or that would be a criminal violation if committed within the jurisdiction of the U.S. or any state, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence a policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by assassination or kidnapping, and occur primarily outside the jurisdiction of the U.S. or transcend national boundaries in terms of the means by which they are accomplished. The persons appear intended to intimidate or coerce, or the locale in which their perpetrators operate or seek asylum. Very broad standing. That means that terrorism can be addressed to terrorism in Afghanistan, Nigeria, if it's directed against Americans or American interests. There are a variety of types of terrorism. State-sponsored terrorism, terrorist acts of a state or government by a state or government. So, for example, the Soviet Union and its actions against its citizens during the period from 1917 to 1991 could in fact be state-sponsored terrorism. There are a number of governments that can be considered engaging in terrorism against their citizens. Dissent terrorism, terrorist groups which have rebelled against their government. Terrorists on the right and the left, groups that are rooted in political ideology. Religious terrorism, terrorist groups which are extremely religiously motivated. And criminal terrorism, terrorist acts used to aid in crime and criminal profit. Here we're talking mainly about drug cartels, but there can be others. The success of terrorism, actually not particularly good. So the lifespan of the majority, or 90% of terrorist organizations, has not exceeded 1 to 2 years. And those that managed to cross that threshold disappeared in about a decade. The main reasons for the disappearance of terrorist organizations have been the capture or killing of a leader. Aum Shinrikyo in Japan, for example, is an example of this. The failure to transition to the next generation. To a certain extent, Al-Qaeda is an example of this, although it's still unknown whether it's transitioning from the generation of Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri. The achievement of the group's aims, the Algerian terrorist, quote-unquote, or nationalist movement, where the Algerian nationalists pushed out the French, and then the Algerians took over the government. The transition to a legitimate political process. The Irish Republican Army is an excellent example of that. The loss of political support, that happens a great deal. Repression, the Chechens would be an example of that. And the transition from terrorism to another form of violence. Among these survivors are a number of religiously motivated organizations. Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, Hezbollah, a Shia organization in Lebanon, which indicates the strength and continuity of religious motivation. The Middle East is where we tend to look at terrorist incidents, although there are other parts of the globe where they exist. So a lot of it existed before the establishment of the State of Israel. So in Hebron in 1929, 67 Jewish settlers in the British Mandate of Palestine essentially set themselves up as a paramilitary force, which ultimately helped to create the government of Israel. In 1931, a more militant group, Irgun, broke away from Haganah, objecting to the Haganah's policy of restraint towards Arabs fighting Jews. After the British restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine in 1939, the Irgun began a campaign against British rule. The most famous attack was the attack on the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. 91 people were killed, and ultimately pushed the British out of Palestine and led to the creation of Israel. After the creation of Israel in 1948, Menachem Begin, the Irgun leader from 1943 to 1948, transformed the group into a political party that later became part of the Likud. The Likud, Menachem Begin went on to become prime minister of Israel, and the Likud still holds power in Israel. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in the 1920s before World War II, in between the wars, and in the late 1940s began to attack British soldiers and police stations. It was founded by Hassan al-Banna. It engaged in assassinating politicians, those collaborating with British rule, most prominently the Egyptian Prime Minister Nukrashi in 1948. British rule was overthrown in 1952 in a military coup, and shortly thereafter the Muslim Brotherhood went underground as the government cracked down on the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood came back into play after the Arab uprising in 2011, won the election in Egypt, but then was replaced by the military. As I mentioned earlier, the Front de Libération Nationale was a nationalist group founded in French-controlled Algeria in 1954. The group was a large-scale movement against French occupation, and the FLN was one of the first anti-colonial groups to use large-scale violence. Many Algerians supported the FLN, and ultimately it secured Algerian independence from France in 1962 and transformed itself into Algeria's ruling party. Fatah was organized as a Palestinian national group in 1954 and exists today as a political party in Palestine. In 1967, Fatah joined the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is an umbrella organization for various nationalist groups. The PLO began its own armed operation in 1965. A variety of Palestinian groups, the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, all engaged in terrorism. The PLO and others have accused Israel of state terrorism for its acts against the Palestinians. Al-Qaeda, which is Arabic for the base, was founded in 1988-89 from jihadists from the war against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and intellectuals from Egypt. So on one hand you had Osama bin Laden, who fought in Afghanistan, and Ayman Zawahiri, who was an intellectual from Egypt, a religious leader, has now taken over the leadership with the death of Osama bin Laden. There were a series of attacks in the Middle East, culminating in the World Trade Center attack on 9/11. Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan in 2011, and his aide Ayman Zawahiri is the current leader. As kind of a subset of Al-Qaeda was the Islamic State. And after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi formed the Islamic State in affiliation with Al-Qaeda. They split over tactics, mainly because Zarqawi would also attack Shia Muslims, and Al-Qaeda wanted to join both groups. Zarqawi was killed in 2006. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi took over and is believed to have died in 2019. The Islamic State grew in Iraq and Syria, and it took a large operation by Kurds, Americans, other groups to essentially push the Islamic State out of Syria and to a certain extent in Iraq, although other members of the Islamic State continue to operate in various parts of the world. Both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic States have followers, but their power has been substantially reduced throughout the world. In Europe, the beginning of World War I was essentially a terrorist act. Archduke Ferdinand of Austria was shot and killed in Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina in Yugoslavia, now back to being Bosnia. And the assassinations produced widespread shock across Europe, starting the events which led to World War II. In 1916, in Ireland, was called the Easter Rising or the Easter Rebellion. Members of the Irish Volunteers and Irish Citizen Armies seized the Dublin General Post Office and several other buildings, proclaiming an independent Irish Republic from Britain. There's actually a very good Netflix film about this, if you're interested. The rebellion failed militarily, but was a success for Irish republicanism. Shortly after the rebellion, the Irish Republican Army was founded. Ireland, with the exception of Northern Ireland, became an independent country in 1949. The IRA continued terrorist operations or anti-British operations for many years, and those subsided in the 1990s after an agreement between the IRA and Britain. The Basques in Spain, who are mainly located near Barcelona, was essentially as a result of the President Francisco Franco's suppression of the Basque language and culture. ETA evolved from a group and became an armed Marxist group demanding Basque independence. Continues to a certain extent today. As I mentioned, the IRA was founded in 1969, sought to create an all-Ireland Irish state. If you look at a map, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, separated from mainland Ireland. Between 1969 and 1997, which was known as the Troubles, the IRA conducted bombings, gun attacks, assassinations, and even a mortar attack on Downing Street. In the early 2000s, the IRA announced an end to its armed campaign. In Germany, the Red Army faction was a Maoist group, had some influence, but fell away pretty quickly because the leaders couldn't get widespread support for their demands. The Red Brigades in Italy was founded in 1970, best known for the kidnapping and assassination of former Prime Minister Aldo Moro in 1978. And I actually covered another incident here, the kidnapping of James Lee Dozier, an American general, in 1981 in Italy, and he was rescued by Italian and American forces. Again, the Red Brigades didn't get much support beyond its base leadership and a few followers. In the Americas, the Front de Libération du Quebec was founded in 1963. As you may know, Quebec is French-speaking. The rest of Canada is English-speaking. The group sought an independence for Quebec. It failed, and Quebec still remains as part of Canada. In Colombia, there were several paramilitary and guerrilla groups formed in the 1960s. In 1983, the president of Peru described armed attacks on his nation's anti-narcotics police as narco-terrorism, which refers to violence waged by drug producers to extract political concessions from the government. Drug cartel leader Pablo Escobar's ruthlessness in Colombia and Peru has been known as one of the best known and best documented examples of narco-terrorism. The Communist Party of Peru, most commonly known as the Shining Path, was a Maoist organization in Peru. Again, it really didn't have much influence other than to create terror because it didn't have widespread support and basically died out after the capture of its leader Abu Mal Guzman in 1992. The Jewish Defense League was founded in 1969 by Rabbi Meir Kahane in New York City, and its declared purpose was the protection of Jews from harassment and anti-Semitism. FBI statistics state that there were 15 acts of terrorism attempted in the 1980s by members of the JDL. It basically, again, didn't get widespread support and kind of died with the death of Meir Kahane. In Asia, as I mentioned, Shinrikyo, now known as Aleph, was a Japanese religious group founded in 1984. And they ran for political office and lost, and then went to use terrorist activities. In 1995, there was a release of sarin gas in the trains in the Tokyo subway. 12 commuters were killed and about 5,000 other people. As a result of this act, Shinrikyo's leaders were arrested and the power and influence died out. Chechen separatists carried out a variety of attacks on Russian targets between 1994 and 2006. The Chechens are Muslims who live in what is now Russia. There were big attacks that happened. There was a war between Russian forces and Chechen forces, and the tension continues between those groups. But the Russians effectively control the areas, and the Chechen rebels have been unable to push them out. An example of state terrorism is China under Mao Zedong. He was accused of state terrorism when an estimated 30 million people died from famine between 1959 and 1962. An estimated 2 million people died in Cambodia under the rule of Pol Pot in the late 1970s. Examples of state terrorism, and as I mentioned, the Soviet Union also engaged in state terrorism throughout its history. In Africa, Boko Haram is a Muslim group in a primarily Christian country in Nigeria. It established in 2002 the Borno state and has been known for kidnapping of various people in Nigeria. In its quest to achieve the agenda, Boko Haram's terror events increased and had both a direct and indirect impact on civilian populations across Nigerian and neighboring countries. There is support and connection between Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and Boko Haram. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab again has ties to Al-Qaeda, and in fact allowed Al-Qaeda to operate there for quite a while. There's armed conflict between Al-Shabaab and the Somali army. It's resulted in massive civilian displacements both within and outside Somalia, and as of 2018, the number of people who have been forced to move and are refugees were about 68 million people in Somalia. So that's it for now. Thanks very much, and we'll see you online. Goodbye now.